Hello and welcome, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield, inviting you into another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. I don't have much to say before we dive into this week's delightful conversation with Patricia Grayis, concert pianist turned pioneering animal communication researcher. Except to thank the 117 of you supporting the show on Patreon right now. I just published on the free public Patreon feed this week the latest draft chapter of my book in progress, How to Live in the Future. And this essay, The Future Acts Like You, will be familiar to any listener of this podcast. A lot of the themes have been explored, especially in recent shows with J.F. Martel on sequels and simulacra, as well as John Danaher's episode about love and sex in the age of convincingly human robotics. If we go back a little further, I had my friend Sarah Huntley on the show, episode 29, talking about the importance of training our machine intelligences correctly, raising them with love, if you will. And that certainly came up in this essay also. So yeah, go check that out at patreon.com/Michael Garfield if you like. There is a prodigious amount of free music like what you're listening to right now on the site as well. And thanks to everybody who has been rating and reviewing the show on iTunes. Last I checked, we were 79 votes in, which means very close to 100, a fine goal. Get this show into the ears and the minds of a larger swath of the folks who will appreciate it. Your ratings and reviews are going to be especially important in the weeks and months to come, as I'm going to step up the production schedule for this show. I have a huge backlog of recorded interviews I've been sitting on, and it pains me, friends, to keep their glory from you any longer than I absolutely must, and so I'm going to hustle hard and try to put out 6 or more episodes a month this summer. That means lots of editing and repetitive computer busy work, so if you feel like chipping me a couple bucks, that would be really cool. I will be sure as well to put out plenty of extras for the Patreon folks as usual. All right, enough about that. This episode is one of the longer in the making episodes of this show, and I think actually one of the strongest and most essential conversations that this show has ever had, precisely because at this moment in history, we are totally opening up our idea of what it means to be human and what it means to be non-human and what it means to be sentient, what it means to be alive, what it means to be conscious. These things are all up for review right now, and in few places is this more obvious or more ethically urgent than when it comes to the study of BioMusic, animal communication through music, and the study of our innately musical brains. So everyone, I am pleased to welcome you to the wonder that is Patricia Grayis. It's wonderful to have you on Future Fossils.
It's a delight to be here.
I don't even know where to start with you because you've got such an eclectic, storied life, and you've done so many things. I think by this point I will have introduced you in the pre-roll and told people that that you're a pianist and an animal music and biological music researcher. But I would still love to start with you just talking a little bit about your life and your history and how you came into the sciences through the arts. I think that's a really compelling place to start this.
Well, I guess I'm sort of living proof of all of the predictions that you should be prepared to segue multiple times in your life's career and sort of follow your muse, because that's exactly sort of the blueprint of how life unfolded. I grew up in a musical family, and we had an orchestra, for instance, that would rehearse in our home. My father was a violinist and my mother was a pianist and organist, and music was the family's language, and so much of the way we related to each other and to the world. So it just sort of followed that I would become a professional musician. And so I was at the piano from the time that I was an infant. I just followed that into undergraduate career and went through all of the degree programs. But basically, I'm a conservatory trained kid, and I moved out of the academic training into a professional life as a concert pianist. And during all of that kind of preceding career, I had a tremendous, rich experience as a chamber musician and as a soloist. And so I have often thought about how powerful music is, not only in my life, but in the lives of the audience members. It's always been so interesting to me that after a concert, people will come back and greet you as though you're a family member and, be so involved in telling you, how they are moved and be very emotional about all of that. It's been, to me, one of those aspects of making music that is thrilling for me, that I can be part of that experience. So living through that experience, I have had a career where I was brought into the National Academy of Sciences as the artistic director of their chamber music ensemble and National Musical Arts. And I was in residence in that capacity at the Academy for 21 years. It was, one of those moments where you don't really think that this is going to last, and then it just keeps unfolding, and it gets richer and richer as it goes along. I happened to get into the Academy at a time when biodiversity was being developed as a concept. And I was brought into an international conference as a performing musician at the Academy. And because this was a conference that focused on the whole topic of biodiversity, in came from all over the world these remarkable scientists who are engaged in really understanding how life on the planet is integrated and relates its whole survival mechanisms to the community of life that's around it. It was a fascinating time for me because many of the people that I immediately engaged with as a musician were people who were at the top of their game in animal communication. And we started to have a conversation about how animal communication had been studied up to that point, which was essentially looking at how animal communication could be translated into language. Basically language was being overlaid as, the format, the recipe, the formula for understanding animal communication. And that had provided a lot of problems regarding, well, there were just a lot of blind alleys for the animal communication people, because you get into a perspective where you're looking for patterns of sound that are repeated that always mean the same thing in the same context. And it just doesn't work like that.
It doesn't even work like that with English.
But, you know, that was the way it was being looked at. Anyway, there was a group of us that sort of were attracted to the idea that maybe there's an unfolding of research and a deeper conversation about animal communication that may be really more related to music. And that really intrigued me because, you know, as I was saying, I have been deeply questioning, you know, my understanding of what music was. And so this group of people that, you know, included some marvelous people like Luis Baptista and Bernie Krause and Roger Payne and, let's see, Mark Tremo and so on. We all decided to call ourselves the BioMusic program, and we became kind of a subset of the chamber music ensemble in residence, and we started actually collaborating and investigating music and animal sounds. And I have continued to segue my career into really pursuing those questions about essentially what I'm looking at is the evolution of music making in our species. That's where we really, you know, sort of get centered here. And if you look at music as human music, then you get stuck very quickly. So I'm going to segue from using that word music to music making. So music making is a process. Human music is a product. So I'm going to go to process versus product. Mm. So the process of music making in our species, I focus on 3 specific areas. One is called beat entrainment, and that's our ability to hear not only music, but other patterns of sound around us and find the underlying connection, rhythmic connection to all of those short, long kinds of relationships that create that pattern. And all normal human beings are able to do that. It's a universal trait in our species. The second thing that I look at is pitch discrimination. Again, something that all of us in our natural form are able to just consider that woo is different than woo is different than woo. Those are our brains immediately understand that that's a different thing. Well, if you look at pitch discrimination across species lines, then you get into, you know, a very interesting conversation. The other thing that our species is able to do very easily is that we can recall combinations of time and sound, what we'll call rhythm and frequency patterns, or we could call them melodies or whatever. But at any rate, once we hear something, we can hold on to it and then we can repeat it back to our satisfaction of what it was. So, for instance, everybody who's listening to this can immediately hear in their heads what happy birthday sounds like. We all could just sing that right now if we together. We do. I mean, when we're in those occasions, all you have to do is just, find a common pitch, and we all do it. So that kind of thing called pitch memory. So those are the three things that I really focus on: beat entrainment, pitch discrimination, and musical memory. And once you have those fundamentals in our species, you can look at whether they occur in other species. And that's where the real fun begins.
So you came into this through resident chamber musician in the National Academy of Sciences. You're collaborating with all these people. I mean, we talked once before, and you mentioned that you were sort of delighted and surprised to discover that so many career scientists are also serious amateur musicians.
Absolutely.
And so there's this, I feel like we can kind of tread a line here between the human part of this, the scientific part of this. But I mean, it sounds to me like you just had a totally smooth transition, that suddenly you're doing science and not just playing piano. How did you actually end up with your own laboratory?
Well, it's a steep learning curve, truly, because I typically sort of intuit musicality around me. But, science wants to know, where's the data? And so moving into that world of, well, yeah, you might think that exists, but it probably doesn't. The null hypothesis is the way science proceeds. And so I've had to really ground myself in what science had been thinking about animal communication, and also, by the way, the outbreak of a lot of research into human musicality, which is it's been in sort of socio psychology field, but it's also now in neuroscience. I happened to come into this kind of integrated, interdisciplinary approach to music at a time when technology was making it possible for us to really drill down deeply into what musicality is in our species. And it hadn't been quite as sophisticated as it is now. So truly the challenge for me and for anybody who's in this in this field is to be able to gloss over from one side of the questions, from the science side, back over to what it's like to actually be in the music. If you are a really intense musician, there's an experience of music that can inform the science. And it's very, very powerful and important to do that, because science can get very hung up on technical questions and data-driven issues that sort of will become its own pathway. And for me, I find that I have to challenge some of the scientists to come back over into the real experience of music in order to, sort of ground what are some of the questions that may have been overlooked. That said, it's very, very interesting to me that, those scientists at the National Academy of Sciences are a tough audience because they are amateur musicians. And so, that common language, excuse me, let me just turn this off.
I found myself in training to that beat there.
Well, one of the things that happens in conversation is that our brains immediately entrain to the same beat, so that we are able to talk with each other without necessarily interrupting each other. Nor do we have to make big stops in order for the other person to be able to pick up and go forward with, an insert or, any kind of sound that encourages you, like or whatever, those are all rhythmically related because our brains just automatically do that sort of thing.
As an aside, you just blew my mind because I've been editing all of the little accidental utterances out of most of the episodes of this show. Like sometimes it's like 6 or 7 minutes of, well, and these are rhythmic cues. And if the whole goal of this show is to leave a rich data record for people to examine this moment in human history, I have screwed up. I have failed these people in the future. I'm hiding our trash or, like vital data from them. But anyway.
Well, all of those little nonverbal sounds and even the gestures that we're making back and forth to each other on this video call are affirming to the recipient that, yes, I'm with you. And that's done in a rhythmic context. So it's a very enriching kind of experience for both of us, because I know that you are with me in this conversation because you're doing this rhythmically with me. And by the way, it's kind of interesting because we've all had the experience where actually our brains are so cued in with each other that we'll actually start to talk at the same time. And then everybody stops, and there's this moment where we try to auto-correct, and then you start at the very same time again, and you keep sort of saying, oh, I'm sorry, no, you first kind of thing. We've all had that experience, but it's our brains saying to the other, I'm paying attention to you, and we are together on this. This is a collaborative kind of communication. So, where in the world were we?
Oh, how you got your lab?
Oh, okay. So the BioMusic group reached a point in the year 2000 where we were invited to present our findings, our collaborative findings, at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I think that they claim to be the largest scientific meeting in the world. But anyways, otherwise, they're referred to within the science world as the AAAS. So we landed a very rich spot at the AAAS meeting, and there were I think 4 or 5 of us that presented that day. It was interesting because it was billed as BioMusic. Nobody at that point in time knew what BioMusic was. So they sort of gave us a small room. Well, the audience for that, it just exceeded the capacity of the room, and there were people standing out in the hallway. So we knew we were onto something. And shortly after that, we published an article in the journal Science that continues today to just have kind of redundant meaning for so many people who have now come into this world of the musicality of the universe. So that article just sort of launched a big response. And the New York Times did a big piece on BioMusic I think it was called something like the Sonata for Whales, Birds, and Humans, or something like that. Anyway, got a lot of press. Then we decided, because there was so much outpouring, so much interest from the public about this, that maybe we should approach the National Science Foundation, the NSF, to see if they would be interested in funding an exhibition about this, because both science and the public were getting very interested in this kind of integrated approach toward the evolution of music making. So the National Science Foundation gave us money to indeed create a science exhibition, which is now still out on the road 9 years later. And that's called Wild Music, Sounds and Songs of Life. And over 1.5 million people have visited that exhibition all over the country at science museums. And every time, it opens in a new science museum, I get all these emails from people who are just so touched by this whole topic because, music is such an important part of our species. So after the science exhibition and the success of that, I also went back to the National Science Foundation and said, I think that there is a way for us to create a curriculum for children. And I would, I think that could be something that would be very powerful because, as I previously stated, all of these things about our musicality are innate within our species. Essentially, let's just sum it up by saying humans are born musical. Therefore, you're given a set of tools to children that they can then learn to use in order to access science. So essentially, the curriculum is focused on the science of music, and that curriculum is called UBeats. And I've applied that with teachers and kids of every dimension, and it's a highly successful kind of curriculum for kids. So now I've got research that I haven't talked about the research. I'm sorry.
No, well, I mean, you've done some really cool stuff too. So yeah, let's open that box.
So when all of the publicity about BioMusic hit the New York Times and the journal Science, I was approached by scientists who are interested in animal communication research. And so my first experience was with bonobo apes. And I was invited to Georgia Tech to interact with a group of bonobos that were in the language research program there. And the reason that I was asked to become part of a research group there was because two of them, both of them by any stretch of the imagination, probably the most famous bonobos in the world, Kanzi and his sister Pambanisha, they had just had I think it was a 3-day session of improv with the musician Peter Gabriel, who had come there. And because these particular bonobos had been raised in an encultured human bonobo kind of setting, those bonobos were already familiar with musical instruments. So they could actually sit at a synthesizer without pounding on it, but actually use it as a tool for interaction in a musical way, but also more sophisticated than the average, human child who, typically will go to a keyboard and frustrated, will just sort of do a cluster of notes. But those bonobos in their improv with Peter were playing one note at a time. And I was so interested in that I was brought into, how do we actually examine musicality in our closest living relatives, bonobos. Oops. I have a cat.
Speaking of animal communication, yeah.
It's very jealous if I'm not talking. So I started interacting with bonobos to try to get a handle on how to actually research musicality in that species. And it was actually Kanzi one day who showed me how to do that. I was waiting for him, or for actually the people who work with him, just kind of set up a synthesizer for him and sort of get him ready to do something. He was on one side of a class while I was on another side. He and I had really spent a lot of time together, so we knew each other very well. And I was just kind of sitting there, sort of rhythmically repeating a kind of a hand slap on the glass wall, in just a regular kind of da, 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 da kind of thing, in boredom, actually. And coming back at me on the other side was my mirror image. That here came Kanzi doing the rhythmic entrainment with my rhythmic slapping of the glass wall. And I thought, holy cow, this is really, really interesting. I wonder how long he'll do this. Well, he just kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And pretty soon, he was brought some green onions, which he just loved. And he rolled over on his back, and he started doing that rhythmic engagement with me with his foot. And so we just kept doing that on. And I thought, this is the way into this particular research with great apes. Is let's look at rhythmic entrainment. How do you find the beat? And so that has been the center of the research with bonobo apes. And we have, I work with neuroscientist Ed Large, and he and I have proven in an article that bonobos have the ability to entrain to a human beat, to a human drummer. Because of the sociality of beat entrainment with each other, we have always structured the methodology of that research around a bonobo entraining to a human drummer. Now, because those particular bonobos were so highly enculturated to humans, we did that research with zoo bonobos at the Jacksonville Zoo in Florida to demonstrate that is an innate ability of bonobos. Mm. But I continue to work with Kanzi and a group of bonobos that are now living in Iowa at the Ape Conservation and Cognition Institute.
So just out of curiosity, you mentioned that this is innate. Like in your TEDx talk, you even show rhythmic entrainment. There's this really cute clip of a seal.
A sea lion.
A sea lion. Pardon. How embarrassing. But you show the sea lion entrained at 130 BPM electronic music, and then again at 137. Yeah. And, it's like raving out. So this seems beyond it just being sort of fundamental to human beings. It's spreading throughout the tree of life. So why do you think it is that white men can't dance? What is going on here? If zoo bonobos can get the groove, then why do some people, do you think it's just a matter of they're thinking about it too much? It's like a self-awareness complication, or what? Are we like poisoned by our technological environments? Is this like brain damage on display?
Well, actually, you're asking a very interesting question. Let me just create a little context here. In the TEDx talk that I do, I show a cockatoo called Snowball and the sea lion Ronan. From the rhythmic entrainment approach to understanding musicality in other species, there have been a fabulous growth of interest from other scientists. And so other species have been looked at. And if you go online and Google Snowball, you'll see this bird who is a rescue bird. The video is actually done in the bird rescue site of somebody who's just putting on a recording. I think it's the Beastie Boys, and Snowball just takes off doing this amazing dance. But here's the context for Snowball's entrainment. He is interacting actually with a human who's dancing as well. And so my colleague Anirudh Patel, who's done the research with Snowball, in order to make sure that Snowball wasn't just imitating, but could actually find the beat on his own, again, didn't want to interrupt the sociality of two species dancing together, essentially, to the Beastie Boys. So what he did was he put earphones on the human and played the Beastie Boys at a different tempo than what Snowball was hearing, so that the human was actually dancing to a slightly different beat, a little slower one than what Snowball was listening to. And so that was so upsetting to Snowball that he actually turned around and stopped looking at the human. But he stayed in train to the beat. The sea lion research is being done by my colleague Peter Cook, and that sea lion's name is Ronan, and he wanted to see whether Ronan could actually find the beat, and also, as you mentioned, prove that you can change the tempo, and Ronan will continue to find the beat at the different tempi. So there's been just a tremendous outgrowth of research into different species, looking at this the sociality of beat entrainment. So we now have a collection of animals that live in social contexts who are able to find the beat. Now, one of the things that comes up in the questions is, well, how come dogs don't dance then? Well, the answer to that is because their bodies are not linked in a way where they can have that kind of control of their physical makeup. Doesn't make it possible for them to have that kind of fine refinement to the beat. So I would suggest that if you really believe that white men can't dance, and I don't necessarily believe that, I mean, we can go to many, many dance schools and look at Fred Astaire movies and see that that's not the case. But it really has to do with, just how well connected you are physically, brain to body. So it's it's a matter of practice, essentially.
So fine motor control.
Yes.
It's interesting that you bring up Patel, because I actually saw him give a talk at UC Irvine in 2010 about music and language. It was called Music, Language, and the Brain. And it's a weird synchronicity that I have a stack of old notebooks that I've torn apart and saved the most relevant pages from sitting on my desk when you brought him up. So you might have seen me tear through that stack to find these rather feisty notes I wrote about my frustrations with that talk. I don't know if it's still the case, but it sounded to me like at the time he was asking the question about the relationship between music and language, and whether music basically has exapted or co-opted neurological systems that were evolved for language, and like whether there was a selection for music and a selection for language, which to me sounded like, one, the guy's not a musician, and two, I mean, I know it's 2010 and that's years and years ago. He actually did mention the bonobo lab and some of the parrot family, elephant family work. But how do you understand that relationship? Like, do you feel, as I guess I do after years of reflection on this, that music is sort of the substrate out of which language grows? Because, you've got that whole thing about, you mentioned melodic memory, the memory of melodic phrases.
I think I'm going to have to take care of a dog.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I love this for being an accurate record of the way that I'm having a conversation with an entire menagerie or ecosystem over there.
Yes, you are so right about that. Okay, so there are, in my estimation, valid reasons for thinking that music really is the fundamental aspect to how communication systems evolve. And just as, in my estimation, obviously the jury is still out on this, but I come from a perspective where I do believe that language rides on this musico-communication system that is kind of a fundamental aspect to the way life is connected. That's my particular bias, and of course it's up to me to try to prove that, but that's where I'm coming from. And there are all kinds of cross conversations about that in the scientific community, but from the way I look at it, just as human music, co-ops this, what I'm going to call the musico-communication system that is the context, the basic ABCs for how communication takes place. That's the way I look at the way language has evolved as well. And so, we've been talking about beat entrainment, but we could go on to the, pitch discrimination as well, and, how our brains and other brains really focus on how frequency patterns are used as signals of recognition and communicative, collaborative kind of environmental community. And, when you think about the way birdsong evolves into a culture of communication, we think about the ability to discriminate as something that sophisticated brains do. In order to really be a creative, complex kind of brain, to be able to manipulate frequency patterns and create new things out of them, there are bird species that do that. There are elephant species that do that. There are whales that do that. So we're not alone on the planet when it comes to being able to create very sophisticated patterns. And even birds that, we think are just kind of one-note Johnnies, even though they've come in with a certain combination of pitches that are signals of their species, as we all know, not every group of birds in an environment sings that particular pattern the same way. There are cultures of chickadees or song sparrows that make different combinations, so that the importance of variation is also an element to being able to recognize frequency patterns. So there's all this flexibility that happens across multiple species lines, so that when we hear a pattern, we say, "Oh, I know who that is," and it's a signature sound. I understand exactly who that neighbor is over there, and what's going on. It's one of those things that Bernie Krause talks about, the importance of the sonic environment, that there is a community of sounds that all of the species in that particular biome understand as being okay. This is normal. This is natural. That particular species is there, and that particular species is there. This is where we are. And, when everybody is sort of in a harmonized environment, then there's an acoustic ecology that is part of that particular biome. And if you start messing around with that, then you start to impact all of the species that are there. So it's
like, wasn't it? I think it was Patrick Flanagan I think it was his presentation I saw at the Global Sound Conference in 2008, where he talked about an epidemic of pet anxiety due to the noise of appliances.
Mm.
And that a lot of the psychological issues that domestic animals are dealing with is that their hearing is much finer than ours, and they're attuned to things like the dog trapped inside a skyscraper apartment complex is like listening to the skyscraper go back and forth, listening to ambulances in the street below, and these are not sounds that are themselves tuned to the psychology of, so like, and you gotta wonder, I think we sort of paper over our animal identity with this sort of modern human thing, but at the same time, I know a lot of people that just go nuts where they can like hear the tube of a fluorescent light bulb or the television is on. Like, I'm one of these people, and I don't know, maybe just put that over to the side in terms of like how it is, how dramatically and how rapidly we've changed our own acoustic environment over the last even like 50 years, and how poorly understood those effects on us and on the other creatures that we coexist with really are.
Well, let's start first in the natural world, okay? Because in the natural world, the importance of sound is frequently underrated. And, we've all had the experience of what it feels like to be in a restaurant that's way too loud, or at a party that's way too loud. And the sounds around you are masking your ability to talk to your neighbor. The band is playing too loudly or whatever, but they're playing in a frequency zone that makes it impossible for you to talk so that your neighbor can hear you, or vice versa. And that happens in nature. I mean, the California, I think it's a sparrow. I'll have to check that. But the traffic on the interstates in California have masked the ability of that bird's call to be heard by its conspecifics. And so the ability for that bird to actually find a mate or its community has been overwhelmed by the sound of the traffic on the interstates. And interestingly, that species has actually raised its pitch pattern higher in order to get into a frequency range where it can actually communicate with its conspecifics. So there's that aspect to just, trying to get your message across. And again, in nature, the clear cutting, for instance, of forests, that actually creates another challenge, because leaves and trees filter out frequencies. And if you're suddenly overwhelmed with a whole bunch of sounds that you're not used to, then, that's very disruptive and creates stress patterns in species. So in nature, being able to predict your acoustic environment and be able to use your acoustic environment to your advantage is an essential piece. Now, in the built environment of our world, where we bring in animals to live with us, remember that there are definitely boundaries on human range of hearing. So there are sounds, there are pitches that are above our range of hearing and below our range of hearing. And by the way, that's also been an essential part of being able to access what is actually going on in the animal world around us. But in the built environment, there are plenty of sounds that we're not able to hear that other species, such as cats and dogs, hear very well and can be importantly impacted in their well-being, in their lifestyle by these other pitches. not everybody probably can hear, a fluorescent light. We all know that there are people can. Jeez. I'm sorry. Everything's going off around here.
Well, it's like Timothy Morton talks about the hyper object. You're inside this sort of, hyperdimensional thing like global warming or the biosphere, and you never see the whole thing. You only see parts of it. And it's like you're inside the musical hyper object, and we're just catching little winks of it. But just to get back to the fact that even though we can't hear, our cats and dogs, in some respects, are kind of giving us their sonic feedback, and those sound waves can be having an impact on us, and probably are. So, stress levels are induced by having too much sensation coming at us, and so those are things to consider. So anyway, to sort of follow up on our range of hearing, however, it wasn't until Katie Payne suddenly realized that when she was with elephants at a zoo, that she was actually she couldn't hear it. She could feel sound waves. And it was because that they are communicating below our range of hearing. And so by then, we had enough technology to be able to actually record infrasound that we started to realize that elephants are using the sonic range below our range of hearing in order to sing their songs. And by the way, bats and mice are singing way above our range of hearing. And so now we have research that is now pulling in these songsters that are around us that we couldn't hear. There's just, and you can go back over scientific history and see that, that there were a lot of pronouncements that these various species were not communicating. Now we know that they are. Are bat and mice songs like step down into human hearing and available to listen somewhere online? Because that's like a I'm going to mix that into sort of like psytrance.
Yes, you can. You can hear it at the lab of Martina Calcunas Ruppel. And I remember the day that Martina brought in recordings of mice. And these were just, little white mice that are found in nature, but also are used for lab mice. And one of the things I found so interesting was that even though the patterns of my songs were rhythmically the same, the frequency relations, the ratios were different. The field mice operated in major and minor seconds, but the lab mice operated in thirds and major thirds. And I thought, what is that about? I don't know what it's about, but it certainly is an interesting, dichotomy here between this. It's the same species, but raised in different environments.
I wonder, just to throw an armchair hypothesis at that one, if it has to do with the fact that laboratory mice don't have predators, and that it has, operating within a narrower spectral band means that they're less likely to sing into the hearing range of another animal that might eat them.
I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah.
I don't
know how you'd test that, except maybe expose lab mice to predators and see if it changes.
I'm sure that we can, come up with a protocol where we can test that. But, at the moment, it's just a fascinating anomaly that the same species would have different ratios of pitch pattern.
Can I pivot here? Because I want to please the audience. And I think that we would be missing a beautiful opportunity if we didn't talk about your work with Roger Payne on whale song and the work that you've done with machine learning to analyze hydrophones from different parts of the Mesoamerican reef. Those two things feel really vital to having like a complete understanding of biomusic.
Sure. So one of my most favorite people on the planet is Roger Payne. Roger and I have been engaged in doing biomusic research now for almost 30 years. And as most people understand, Roger and his wife, Katie, his wife at that time, were the premier and first researchers to, first of all, establish that whales were singing songs. I found that to be shocking when Roger told me that he had a mighty battle to actually convince scientists that these sounds were songs. And so he and Katie focused on the structure of what they were recording. And they realized that the whale were singing in phrases, that they were singing in coupled phrases, and that there was what they called rhyming, that there would be in these coupled phrases an agreement at the end of the phrase of how that phrase would be repeated with just the same kind of pitch pattern that had been preceding it. So it's what they called rhyming. And that particular research just changed everybody's understanding about what was going on out there in the oceans with humpback whales. And since then, I have spent some time also with humpback whales trying to hear a deeper structure of how whale songs are put together. And what my colleague Josh Marquez and I have done is actually looked at a way of analyzing the whale songs on a larger time frame, so that you are actually looking at how 4 or 5 pitches are used as the basis of a particular song, and then whether they are transposed or moved along in the same relationship. And so we have uncovered a very, very deep structure of whale song that is really based on a combination of just 4 or 5 pitches that are essentially what you might call the refrain, and then a variation that moves away from those, and sort of an elaboration section, and then a return to the refrain section, so that you get what in music's called an ABA. And that is such an old way in human music of organizing music making, that it's so fascinating, because it also begs the question that a lot of animal researchers have been pulling their hair about, and that is whether there is a recursive aspect to any kind of song making out in the wild. Well, that makes it right there, is that deep structure is actually there in whale songs, and it makes them have the ability to recall, therefore, in musical memory, a very elaborate song that takes place maybe sometimes as long as 20 or 30 minutes. And that ability to recall a seasonal song that has been created by a particular group of whales in a particular ocean, that is a recall that makes it possible for them to sing that communal song for their entire singing season, which is 6 months. And then when they go off to their hunting grounds in the summer, they are quiet. They are not singing. I can talk a little bit about the sounds that they're making when they're hunting together, but they're not singing the communal song while they're feeding on their sites up in Alaska. When they return to the breeding grounds, they start with last year's seasonal song. So they have held this song together in their brains for 6 months, and they start by returning to the seasonal song that they stopped singing for 6 months. So that structure that we are uncovering now, a way of helping them find in their memory how that is all structured. It's a fascinating process, and it just shows you how complex these social brains are in whales.
I want to ask you about, because this has come up sort of a couple of different times. I've glimpsed this in the conversation. I remember reading in Nicholas Carr's book, The Glass Cage, where he was talking about there being concern among some neuroscientists that children who grow up using turn-by-turn map instructions like Google Maps to get around may end up growing up to suffer early onset Alzheimer's because memory is based on these like orientational neural networks in the brain that the first thing we kind of remember, and therefore also the first thing we forget in Alzheimer's often, is where we are, how we're oriented with our environment. And you're talking about humpback whales, which go on this epic migration. A lot of not all, but a lot of vocalizing birds are migratory animals. Humans obviously live in really complex, not just social groupings in terms of our interpersonal relationships, but the psychogeography of a city, that we live in these complex landscapes. And I remember reading in my animal communications seminar in college, the authors escape me now, but the paper was on the cultural trap hypothesis for the emergence of syntactic language in birds, and basically saying that they believed that more complex forms of communication emerged out of the need to develop and learn other animals' dialects because the ecosystem of that particular bird is so heterogeneous that they have to travel farther to find the tree where their mate might be, and then they have to kind of sing in a different kind of language about it. So I'm curious what your thoughts are with respect to all of this about the relationship between place and memory and song. And, like the Aboriginals' song lines across Australia, and the way that we orient ourselves in a piece of music being so similar to the way that we orient ourselves in a landscape.
Let me start with what we know about babies, human babies. Okay, so we're talking now about the children who have actually heard music while they are still in the womb. Neonatals will recognize that music when they're, first born. We know that because you can play same and different melodies to them, and if they hear something that's different than what they heard in the womb, they'll look at it. So we know that they understand that's different than the melody that I expected it to be. We also know that instinctively mothers and fathers do something called motherese communication with babies. And that's that sing-song, oh, hi, how are you? The words don't matter. It's really this musical interaction. And babies start to pay attention to those pitch patterns that they hear their caregivers send over to them whenever they're together. And there's an entrainment, beat entrainment aspect to babies too, that you can look at online, where if they hear music, they can swing their bodies or their legs pretty much in synchrony with the beat. They don't have as great body motor skills as they will have when they're 9-10 years old, but they're pretty good at it. They're very good at it, actually. So infants start to understand their environment as a musical scheme, that their caregivers are giving them an orientation to the world that is musical. And it becomes then part of their relationship of how are we going to interact together. And you'll hear that babies will start to learn that turn taking that we were talking about a little while ago. When mom comes in to change diapers or pick up the baby or whatever, that there'll be this, oh, hi, baby, how are you? And then but you have this little babbling going on from the child in response. So turn taking starts to take place, not only sonically, but also in movement of the child's body. They'll start to, actually interact rhythmically with what is going on around them. There becomes a family culture of musicality, what is being played on the radio or what, music is coming into their world through all these technologies that are now in our homes. And that starts to actually narrow the scope of what is acceptable as a musical preference. What is my preferred music? And so it happens very quickly in, whichever culture you're talking about, that my preferred music is based on the Western system of harmonic relationships, scales, and so on. In Asia, where we have languages that are tonal languages, I don't know if you've tried to actually learn Chinese, but you'll find that you make a lot of mistakes because you're not sonically as discriminating. You may think that you're saying the same thing, but the pitch is not right. And so you end up, miscommunicating, because the discriminating ear for pitch is much more attuned in those languages. There are certain musical systems in the Middle East that use what we call quarter tones. There are many more pitches between C and D. For instance, in our system, there are more frequencies that are used in music making than what we're used to. And so if you listen to, let's say, Carnatic music from southern India, or you listen to Arabian music, listen to an oud, for instance, concert, you are missing, if you are a Western kid who have grown up listening to rock and roll or used to hearing hymns played in church or playing the piano or playing in a band or whatever, you're missing a lot of the nuance of music of other systems because your ear's just not trained to hear that.
Yeah, I to bring it up a second time in this conversation, I've been reading the book Hyperobjects by Timothy Morton. It's he's an object-oriented philosopher at Rice University in Houston, and he's got this whole section on the movement sort of out of the Romantic era and through the modern era and into whatever you want to call what we're living in now musically. Everything since like John Cage and LaMonte Young, and how they broke out of the well-tempered clavier and into the just intonation and the so-called wolf notes that occur in in these instruments that are tuned to whole ratio relationships, and how it's fascinating to me that Morton's argument, is basically that this is a relaxation of our efforts to control music and an admission of the agency of music itself, and a sort of like an invitation of the non-human back into the human artistic sphere. And he like specifically says, like if you look at the reason, like we call them wolf notes because we drove them out of civilized composition, and now we're welcoming them back in. And just at the moment that music that's written with just intonation, or has just abandoned sort of any sort of classical intonation scheme, it makes it very difficult to tell the same story compositionally. The keys don't flow into one another as well. And so you get, if you move from key to key rather than sort of hang out in an ambiance, then you get all of these unpleasant to the modern Western ear sounds. And those are the sounds of the non-human re-entering our space. So it's like right as our sort of story of progress is breaking down, and the romantic telling of that story and music is breaking down, then we get just intonation, and then art always precedes science, and then within a few decades we're studying whale song and bonobo beat entrainment, and it's like there's this sense in which it required us to break out of the conceptual limitations and allow the wilderness to speak through music again before we were even capable of acknowledging that other species were doing this. I don't know.
Well, so much of how we organize, quote, the harmony part of music making is really about how to make sure that we can play with instruments. And the more that we concentrate on the vocalization of music, the freer we become on that level. And if you want to hear, a free-ranging vocalization, whale song is what that is. Now, with that said, what is particularly curious to me is that humpback whale song can actually be fitted into the harmonic relationships that we humans actually use in the Western sense. And, you can hear that, with Paul Winter, and I also put on a composition hat every now and then, and I've created music where I've played with piano and sax and recordings of whale song, and have been able to make that into a satisfying musical experience for the audience without having to tweak any frequencies of whales. And there is a kind of pure ratio of pitches that whales do seem to prefer in when they are composing their songs. And that basic relationship of what we call fourths and fifths and octaves, that just permeates their construction. Even if one of the things that we analyze is what's called a slide by scientists, but in the music world we call it a glissando, where they start on a pitch and then just go whoa. That beginning pitch and the end pitch actually has a relationship to that deep structure that I was talking about. It fits into that underlying deep structure. So, there is kind of an underlying formation of melodic relationships that segue from the wild into human music making. It gets contrived and constrained, I think, by a lot of instruments trying to play together. That becomes complicated. And, the orchestra form has sort of concretized a lot of those problems. But when you get back into just pure vocalization with, say, some percussion, then you get back into, I think, a pure state of how this all is organized musically.
Do you find it as weird as I do that we're separated from whales by more than 50 million years, and yet these relationships are common to us?
I don't find it weird. I find it very exciting.
I mean, what do you think it calls to mind the uncanny efficacy of mathematics and this question of whether, like sacred geometry, like whether these are, in some sense, these ratios are universal and cosmic, and like Fibonacci retracements and Elliott wave theory in the stock market. It's like, there it is. There's the golden ratio right there in the day trading. So like, what the hell is going on here? Like W.A. Matthew in The Musical Life talks about, we call a musical third and a musical fifth, but the third is 1/5 the length of a string and the fifth is 1/3 the length of a string. Like, how did that happen? I mean, maybe we're going off the deep end, but we are talking about whales. So,
well, I don't know really where to go, because I think if we go into the Fibonacci direction, I'm not sure our audience is going to go with us there.
I think they'll follow us anywhere. They've made it over an hour so far.
Oh no! Oh no! And we haven't even gotten to the hydrophones. Off the coast of the Mesoamerican reef here.
Feel free to take this anywhere you want.
I do find it very exciting, whether it's math, it could be a physiological aspect to our beings that, prefer certain combinations of frequencies. Certainly, I find it so actually grounding that our brains, our ancient lizard brains, are on the same sonic musico-communication path as whales. I just think that is reassuring for us, that we are so connected to the wild through our musicality, through our musical brains. And because we have this circuitry, this musical circuitry that actually, is in the deepest part of our brains, in our cerebellum and in the amygdala and so on, that this is the way that we can actually reconnect with the wild, because we are, we're looking at this huge evolution of musicality through these species. And because, by the way, that musical circuitry in our brain is so deep, it's a doorway to all kinds of exciting therapies and that are being used today to bring, for instance, autistic children into the social world, or children who have severe physical handicaps can, through new technology, use, again, music in order to connect socially with their communities. And the ability to retrain the brain through the musical circuitry after stroke or TBIs, actually growing the beat entrainment circuitry in our brains. So this connection of the deepness of our musicality into the natural world is just opening up all kinds of opportunities and possibilities for us. I do want to just talk briefly here about, how we've been planting hydrophones off the coast of Cancun in the Mesoamerican reef. And we've had 3 different sites that we've used these hydrophones. One is off the coast of Isla Contoy, which is a barrier island that is a wildlife preserve, and you are not allowed to be out there without a permit. So it's a pristine area. And then the second hydrophone was at a barrier island, but on the Atlantic Ocean side, so away from the interior part, leading into the developed area of Cancun. And then the third area was in an interior part of Cancun that has been developed for tourism, and there are snorkelers and divers and so on there. So we had 3 very distinct sonic environments, and of course huge data sets, because we had set the hydrophones to come on every 15 minutes and then record for 30 seconds. And when you plant these hydrophones and leave them for 6 months or a year, what you have is this huge data set. And so that required us to develop a machine learning software program, and so that we could then start to pick up those patterns of sonic expression at the reef by those species that live at the reef and those that are migratory, and then those species that have to interact all the time with humans who are tourists who are doing snorkeling and so on. And so we started, we're looking again for patterns, those kinds of patterns that then create anomalies that show up. We can access those, but the machine learning, was an essential part of being able to start to wrestle this data into some kind of understanding of what is going on there. And so what we started to understand is there are times of the year, there are times of the day, times of the night when the sound is turned up and, everybody is interacting with each other, and then there's silence. That's all relational to season. It has to do with the sun as well and its placement in the sky. And obviously, when you have a lot of boat traffic and human sound making, then that also interrupts life patterns of all of these various species that are trying to survive in this particular marine environment. So it's been a very interesting kind of learning curve again for somebody who's come off of a piano bench to understand, how is it that we can grasp, how we can understand what is going on around us in very critical populations that will impact quality of life on the planet. And we can do it sonically. I mean, this is so exciting.
Yeah. I agree. I think I was tracking your work and the work of other folks for years for this very reason. Just this notion of weaving the life world, the experience, the field of biosemiotics. My graduate advisor, Sean S. Bjorn Hargens, who was on episode 60 of this show, he was the one that turned me on to that whole discipline and the idea of studying what it is to be a frog, communicating with other frogs in a space where you have crickets and other frog species, and that this is all going around us all the time. And, we live in a hyper communicative world, I guess, but again, to welcome that wolf note into the orchestra, and to feed it, it all kind of boils down to how does this reshape the way that we govern human civilization, over the next few decades, as this knowledge starts to permeate society and starts to have a bigger impact on conservation and restoration ecology, and on development, and on shipping, right? You know, just the way that, you know, like the military sonar affecting ocean creatures. What do you hope comes out of all of this? Like in the, you know, in another 10, 20, 50, however long, what do you see as the real fruit that grows out of the seeds of your research? And how do you hope that society changes in light of this knowledge?
Well, you know, for me, it gets down to, well, why is all this musicality important? I think that we meaning in a global sense, all species, are in this social network where we all have a way of interacting with our conspecifics. And this musical communication system is a central part to how life actually gets along and moves along. And so from my perspective, if we can start to think about music making, musical communication as essential to survival, then we start to think much differently about our connections to each other. There's a very interesting set of research that has been done about when people make music together, or they're at a concert together and they're moving together and so on, that our brains actually produce a neurochemical neuropeptide called serotonin. It makes us feel good to be together. And one of the things that I am concerned about in the long run is that we as a species are sort of coming apart by being so focused on the visual, on emailing instead of talking to each other, of being so engaged in eye candy instead of really hearing and discriminating tone of communication with each other, or being in the same room with each other. I mean, I much prefer, for instance, having a video call with somebody so that I can actually have that kind of body interaction with each other, so that we're nodding to each other, or, you know, we're showing each other that we are connected in this conversation, and that there's an affirmation that I understand what you're saying and you understand what I'm saying. That connection is a central part not only of our species, but it's also a central part of that we're finding out of other species. You know, being able to recognize each other just by the way we walk. You know, if you see somebody coming down the street, you can recognize who that is by the rhythmicity of the way their body moves, you know, and you can call that, for instance, a signature of that person, that you recognize that signature. Well, dolphins recognize the signature of each other when they're in the ocean. Now, what is that signature sound? They typically live in groups of 3 or 4, these little pods of dolphins, and they hunt and so together. And they have a signature song that they can recognize each other by. So they know, oh, well, that's, you know, that's so-and-so coming back to the pod. It's not a stranger. It's our pal. It's our gang. It's our particular little group person. And by the way, when dolphins, you know, lose one of their group, then when a new dolphin joins, they have to learn that signature sound that has been developed by the group. That acclimation to each other through rhythm, through sounds, through songs, whatever, that's what culture is built on. And the more that we actually become aware of how important this musical life that we are in, the more important it will be to understand that when you are out in the environment, that you are connected to all of that stuff, that you will understand that the birds are not just making noise, but they are actually, there's a pattern that you can recognize, you could imitate, you could be part of that natural world. That's what I'm so focused on, trying to bring kids into this world of biomusic, because it becomes a connection to the planet that is so primal, so critical to their survivability. It connects them to all life forms, but it also helps them interact with their conspecifics in their human world. And to pay attention to how the sonic environment that you live in, is it really a positive experience for you, or is it clutter? Is it overwhelming your ability to be all that you can be, to be the full human? I mean, have you got too much sound in your life? Does it need to be cleared out every now and then so that you can actually let your brain use that pathway to understand the world? There are many, many levels of where this research is going. It's going to help us understand other species, how other species organize their lives, how we are connected to the larger life network around us, how we're going to understand our brains, how we're going to develop new therapies for our well-being and our wellness. All of these are part of the sonic world that is an essential, to me, even more important than eyesight, even though a lot of people would be shocked to hear that. But if you can actually think about and listen to how rich your life is, it will become a way for you to understand the world on a level that you are not used to really accessing, and it will enrich your life.
I gotta say, my partner bought a vinyl record turntable last week.
Yes.
And we finally have a way of playing all of these records we've accumulated. And immediately everything changed in the house. Immediately it was like, all right, we're adults now. It's time to take this all very differently. And everything sort of reorganized around it.
You're going analog.
Yeah, bringing that richness and that depth to our sonic experience. And of course, you and I, it took us probably half an hour to get this call together, in part because there are guys power washing my house right now. So that's the other end of the spectrum, is the, well, okay, I can survive this for a bit. Anyway, Patricia, I'm just in awe of the breadth and the depth of your work and the work of your colleagues. And I really appreciate you giving so many people shout outs so that folks can follow up on a broader cut of this entire field. It's really been fun jamming with you across the glass here. So where can people find you?
Well, thank you for raising that, because right now I'm at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and I head up the BioMusic program there. When I left the National Academy of Sciences, I was recruited to come to the university and to bring all of this activity and research with me. And so that has been my post. Now, because I am so emphatic about the importance of this for children, I'm in the throes of developing an animation series that will have an interactive website and a gaming app as well, so that kids start to understand how connected they are to the natural world through their musical selves, their musical brains. They've been gifted with this because of the evolution of our species, and this is a way for them to actually learn about the world and increase their knowledge through their listening and their musical brains.
So that app will be out sometime, and it'll be called what?
Well, right now, the series is called Caruso's Wild Sounds, and we're in the throes of trying to get the attention of the big streaming services like Netflix and Amazon and so on. So we're hoping that we'll be able to get this out there for kids and help them tune up their ears so that they understand how important it is to be social using their musicality. And
so people can also find your research on the UNC website also?
That's right. You can just, Google me at University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I can't remember the URL right now, but it's it's there. You'll find it.
All those .edu URLs are awful anyway.
I know. They're never as tight, as the commercial side.
They lack a certain cadence. But
they're just not cool, that's all. They're just not cool.
Their groove is not in the pocket. Anyway, dude, it's been a blast. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Okay, great.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. Future Fossils is part of the MindPod network, along with Third Eye Drops, the Astral Hustle, Synchronicity Podcast, and an oodle of other fascinating programs. I encourage you to go to mindpodnetwork.com and subscribe to them all. And stay tuned, because we have some awesome episodes coming up on Future Fossils, including a conversation with David Krakauer, the president of the Santa Fe Institute for Complexity Science. So stick around and have a most excellent eon.